In the early 1930s, a Japanese infantry platoon moved through the fields and villages of Manchuria. Out front marched riflemen carrying Arisaka Type 38s. Behind them came a small group of soldiers carrying something different, a weapon meant to change the way the Japanese army fought. It didn't look like most machine guns of the time. It had no box magazine, no belt of ammunition, no massive barrel like the heavy machine guns. Instead, an odd open hopper feed mechanism sat on top, into which soldiers slid standard 5-round rifle chargers, the same ones used to load an ordinary infantry rifle. This was the Type 11 light machine gun, Japan's first mass-produced light machine gun, built specifically to give the infantry squad its own firepower. The Japanese army was trying to solve a problem that had emerged during the First World War. Warfare had changed. Machine guns had made open assaults nearly impossible, but heavy machine guns were still too large and heavy to keep pace with infantry advancing quickly. Armies everywhere went looking for an answer. France built the Shosha. The United States adopted the Browning automatic rifle. Britain fielded the Lewis gun. Japan chose its own path, a weapon that fused the rifle and the machine gun into one. One cartridge, one supply chain, one set of ammunition for every soldier to carry. The idea was simple. Every infantryman already carried rifle ammunition, so why shouldn't the light machine gun fire the very same rounds? No separate magazines to issue, no special cartridges to produce, no extra logistics to manage. But that idea carried a hidden cost. What looked like an advantage on paper became one of the weapon's biggest problems on the battlefield. The Type 11 was too complicated, too sensitive to dirt and fouling, and it demanded far more care from its crew than most other light machine guns of its era. This is the story of a weapon that tried to solve tomorrow's problem using yesterday's ideas. The story of the engineer who laid the foundation for 20th century Japanese small arms, of an army trying to make its infantry more mobile, and of a machine gun that turned out to be both groundbreaking and deeply flawed. This is the story of the Type 11 light machine gun. At the start of the 20th century, the Japanese army was changing fast, moving in just a few decades from a nation with a limited industrial base to a state capable of fielding a modern military. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 showed the world that Japan's army had become a serious fighting force, but it also exposed new problems. Infantry increasingly ran into fortified positions, and the sheer volume of fire on a battlefield was starting to decide battles. Before the First World War, the rifle was the backbone of the Japanese infantryman's arsenal. Its standard rifle was the Type 38 Arisaka, adopted in 1905, chambered for the 6.5 by 50 mm Arisaka cartridge, and known for its reliability and accuracy. But after 1914, everything changed. The war showed that an infantry unit without its own automatic weapon was at a serious disadvantage, and French, British, and German forces began experimenting with light machine guns that could move forward with an advancing line. The machine gun could no longer be just a defensive weapon. It had to move with the soldiers and let a squad generate its own volume of fire. Japan had fought on the Allied side and seized Germany's Pacific holdings, but its direct role in the European fighting had been limited, so its officers watched how weapons were evolving elsewhere and tried to work out what actually fit the Japanese army. Mobility mattered above all. The army had always emphasized a maneuverable infantry that could move quickly across mountains, forests, and rice paddies. A heavy, tripod-mounted machine gun needed a crew of several men and time to set up. It was effective, but poorly suited to offensive maneuver. Japan needed something light, portable, and able to move with the squad. It was in this period that a man emerged who would shape the future of Japanese small arms, Kijiro Nambu. He was no ordinary army officer, but an engineer who devoted his career to designing weapons for the Japanese army. His work would later produce some of the most recognizable Japanese small arms of the century: the Nambu Type 14 pistol, the Type 3 heavy machine gun, the Type 11 light machine gun, and later the Type 96 and Type 99. But before the Type 11, Nambu had to solve one central problem. How do you build an automatic weapon an ordinary Japanese soldier can use alongside his own rifle? If a soldier already carries rifle ammunition, the logic went, why should the machine gun fire something else? Nambu was born in 1869, part of a generation of Japanese engineers who came of age during the Meiji era, when Japan was rapidly adopting Western technology and building a modern state. He entered the army after military school and quickly showed a talent for weapons engineering, at a time when Japan wanted to stop depending on imported systems and start designing its own. His approach was practical. Rather than copy foreign designs, he adapted them to Japan's own conditions: limited industrial resources, a need to conserve materials, and punishing climates from the cold plains of China to the humid islands of the Pacific. In the early 1920s, Nambu was tasked with something new, not a scaled-down heavy machine gun, but an entirely new class of weapon, a machine gun that would become part of the squad itself. The result was the Type 11. Nearly every army after the First World War faced the same question: how do you give an infantry squad more firepower without adding to its burden? Most countries answered with detachable magazines or belts, the French with magazines, the Americans with box magazines for the BAR, the British by refining the Lewis gun. Japan decided it could find a simpler path. Instead of supplying the machine gun with its own magazines, use something every infantryman already carried: rifle ammunition. This was the defining decision behind the Type 11. The weapon would fire the standard 6.5 by 50 mm Arisaka round, the same cartridge as the Type 38 rifle. On paper, the advantages were enormous: no extra magazines to carry, no separate ammunition to produce, and any rifleman in the squad could simply hand his cartridges to the gun crew. But making that idea work required an unusual feed system. Nambu abandoned the conventional magazine and instead mounted a hopper mechanism on top of the receiver. Standard 5-round Arisaka chargers slid straight into it, and a spring system fed the rounds downward into the feed line. When one charger emptied, the next automatically took its place. In theory, the gun could keep firing indefinitely as long as the crew kept feeding in fresh chargers. Most armies were moving toward high-capacity dedicated magazines. Japan instead built a weapon that used rifle chargers in place of one, reflecting a doctrine in which the machine gun wasn't meant to exist on its own, but to feel like an extension of every soldier's own rifle. The Type 11 was officially adopted in 1922, its name taken from the Japanese imperial calendar, the 11th year of the Taisho era. It ran on a gas piston system, and because the 6.5 by 50 mm Arisaka round produced less recoil than many contemporary rifle cartridges, a lighter weapon was possible. The Type 11 weighed roughly 10.2 kilograms, compared with about 18 for the German MG08/15, 12 for the British Lewis gun, and 8.8 for the American BAR. It sat somewhere between a rifle and a full support machine gun, air-cooled, with a barrel too light for sustained bursts. Its job was short bursts, supporting an attack, suppressing the enemy, covering riflemen as they advanced. and its rate of fire, about 500 rounds per minute, was deliberately moderate, since a faster cyclic rate meant burning through more ammunition and making the weapon harder to control. It was meant to be economical and easy to manage. But this is exactly where its first serious problem emerged. Every weapon is a compromise. For the Type 11, the great advantage was simplicity of supply. But that simplicity came at a steep price. Unlike a conventional magazine that sealed rounds inside a closed housing, the Type 11 left part of its feed system exposed to dust, dirt, sand, and moisture. Lubrication was an especially dangerous weak point. The gun required special oil on the cartridges to reduce friction, but in dusty regions, that oil acted like a magnet for grit, mixing with sand into an abrasive paste that sometimes made the mechanism run worse rather than better. In the hands of a diligent, well-trained crew, the Type 11 could perform well, but real combat rarely offered ideal conditions. Despite its flaws, the Type 11 marked an important step. It was Japan's first mass-produced squad light machine gun, and it signaled a shift in thinking. Japan no longer wanted to rely on rifle volleys alone, understanding that the future belonged to mobile, automatic firepower. Even an imperfect design proved the underlying idea was sound, and the weapon became an important stepping stone. Its mistakes would later be corrected in the Type 96, but first, it had to face the test of war. Once adopted, the Type 11 reached units of the Imperial Japanese Army, and it demanded a new way of working together. An ordinary rifleman operated alone, but a machine gun crew functioned as a single unit. One man carried the weapon, another handled ammunition, and the rest of the squad provided cover and brought up chargers. On the training ground, the concept that any soldier could feed cartridges to the gun crew looked efficient. But war always exposes the gap between theory and reality, and the Type 11's first serious combat test came during Japan's operations in China. After the First World War, Japan steadily expanded its influence across East Asia, seizing Manchuria in 1931 and establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, the first major test of Japan's armed forces in this new era. Japanese units often operated in small groups, launching fast attacks and trying to keep up the tempo of an advance. Exactly the kind of fighting the Type 11 was built for, letting its crew move alongside the infantry and generate firepower on the spot. The underlying idea was sound, but the China campaign also revealed the limits of the design. In combat, the flaws that had shown up in testing became far more serious. The core problem was the feed system. A mechanism built around rifle chargers was too complicated for real battlefield conditions, where soldiers were under fire, slogging through mud, fighting in heat, dust, and rain. Every extra step in operating the weapon increased the chance of something going wrong. Where an ordinary machine gun simply took a magazine or belt, the Type 11's crew had to constantly manage an exposed, open feed mechanism, which took discipline and experience. The gun was also highly sensitive to fouling and needed frequent cleaning, especially in dusty regions, manageable for a well-trained unit, but a support weapon needs to be as simple as possible, working even when the soldier operating it is exhausted, wounded, or caught in the chaos of battle. That was the central lesson the Army took from the Type 11. Despite its shortcomings, it wasn't considered a failure. It did its job, giving Japanese infantry a genuine automatic weapon at the squad level. Through the 1930s, many armies went through a similar process. The Shosha proved deeply problematic. The Lewis gun was effective but complex and expensive. The BAR was reliable but limited by its small magazine. Every army was searching for its own balance, and Japan had traded simplicity for a unified ammunition supply. But by the mid-1930s, it was clear the next light machine gun would need to be far more dependable. Commanders could see the Type 11's advantages. It was reasonably light, fired the standard cartridge, and let infantry move faster. But the feed system remained the central weakness, and the Army increasingly recognized the advantages of a proper detachable magazine. It protected the ammunition, swapped faster, and was easier to maintain. So Japanese engineers, once again led by Nambu, developed the Type 96 light machine gun, adopted in 1936, with a detachable 30-round box magazine, a simpler mechanism, and a quick-change barrel. It kept the Type 11's core ideas, lightweight, squad-level use, gas-operated action, but abandoned its defining feature, the notion that a machine gun should feed the same way a rifle does. That was, in effect, an admission that the original concept had real limits. The arrival of the Type 96 didn't mean the Type 11 vanished overnight. The Army already had thousands in service, with soldiers trained to use them, so it continued serving alongside more modern designs, especially in second-line units, with some still in use well into the Second World War. But by the start of the Pacific War, it was already becoming obsolete, and the main burden shifted to the Type 96 and later the improved Type 99. To understand the Type 11's significance, it helps to see it as the beginning of an entire lineage. Before it, the Japanese Army had mainly relied on heavy machine guns like the Type 3, weapons of position, needing a crew and a tripod built for sustained fire. The Type 11 was a weapon of movement instead, meant to advance with the infantry rather than hold a line for hours, and that idea became fundamental going forward. After it came the more reliable magazine-fed Type 96 in 1936, and then the Type 99 in 1939, chambered for a new 7.7 by 58mm cartridge, and the final development in the line. Each weapon fixed the problems of the one before it, and the Type 11 was the first step. Today, the Type 11 often sits in the shadow of better-known Japanese weapons, the Arisaka rifle, the Type 96, the Type 99. It was never Japan's most successful weapon, never a symbol of victory or defeat, and never earned the reputation of a German MG-34 or an American BAR. But its real significance lies elsewhere. It was an experiment, an attempt to answer a fundamental question. How do you give an ordinary infantry squad its own automatic firepower? Although the solution was flawed, the underlying idea was correct. Every modern army today fields squad-level support weapons that move with the infantry, and the Type 11 was Japan's early answer to that question. By the time Japan entered the wider war in 1941, the Type 11 was no longer its primary light machine gun, though thousands of examples remained in arsenals and frontline units, used in reserve units, training formations, and wherever newer weapons weren't available. The Pacific War was very different from the conflicts the Type 11 had been designed for. The Japanese Army now faced an enemy with enormous industrial capacity, while Japan itself was constantly short on resources, meaning older equipment stayed in service far longer than intended. The conditions of this new war amplified every one of the Type 11's weaknesses. Humid jungles, mud, tropical heat, and limited maintenance capacity were brutal on a delicate feed system, especially on Pacific Islands where soldiers were often cut off from major supply bases. Certain weapons become symbols of their era. The MG-34 and MG-42 for German industry, the Browning M1919 for the American Army, the Vickers for the British. the Type 11 rarely makes that list, not only because of its flaws, but because it arrived during a transitional period. The Army was only beginning to understand the role of the light machine gun when it entered service. And by the time the Second World War began, it was already outclassed. Building the Type 11 also reflected the state of Japanese industry in the 1920s. Unlike the United States or Germany, Japan had far more limited manufacturing capacity, and every design had to account for what its factories could actually deliver. The gun was produced at state arsenals, including Kokura and Nagoya, which handled not just manufacturing, but development and testing, with engineers working directly alongside military officers. That let designs change quickly, but it also meant the Army ended up with a huge number of distinct weapon models, since every new idea tended to produce an entirely new design, rather than a gradual improvement of an old one. The Type 11 was the first attempt of its kind, followed by the Type 96 and Type 99, each solving the problems of the one before it. The story of the Type 11 is inseparable from the story of the man who built it. Kijiro Nambu became one of the most important Japanese weapons designers of the century, his name tied to nearly every major small arms system of the pre-war era. Yet his legacy is hard to sum up simply. He built genuinely innovative designs, understood the importance of mobility, and saw the future of infantry warfare earlier than many in the Japanese military. But some of his solutions were needlessly complicated. Japan's weapons design tradition often favored technically interesting solutions at the expense of ease of production and maintenance, and the Type 11 is the clearest example. Its feed system was genuinely original and showed real engineering ingenuity. But on the battlefield, a soldier doesn't need originality. He needs confidence that his weapon will fire every time. That was the lesson the Army ultimately drew. Compared with its contemporaries, the picture is clear. The British Lewis gun had a solid reputation for reliability, but was harder to manufacture. The Type 11 fit more easily into Japan's supply chain thanks to its shared cartridge with the standard rifle. The American BAR was extremely reliable and mobile, though its 20-round magazine limited sustained fire. The Type 11 had a theoretical edge in continuous feed, but the complexity of its mechanism undercut much of that advantage. The French Chauchat, often considered one of the most controversial light machine guns of the war, shared a similar underlying philosophy: the lightest possible automatic weapon for ordinary infantry. Germany's later MG-34 took a different approach entirely, treating the machine gun as the central weapon of the squad, while Japan's Type 11 functioned more like a reinforced automatic support rifle, a difference reflecting two very different military doctrines. After the Second World War ended, the Type 11 effectively disappeared. Japan was disarmed, its military structures dissolved, and most of its weapons destroyed, seized, or put into storage. Unlike the Arisaka rifle, which stayed in use in various countries long after the war, the Type 11 never had much of a post-war life. It was already obsolete as the world moved on to intermediate cartridges, assault rifles, and more versatile machine guns. It remained tied to a very specific moment in history, a time when armies were still searching for an answer to one question: what should a squad-level machine gun actually look like? The story of the Type 11 doesn't end on a battlefield. It ends where so many military projects end, in the memory of the people who designed them, carried them, and eventually replaced them. Today, it's rarely remembered as one of Japan's most famous weapons, It never achieved the iconic status of the Arisaka rifle, and never earned the legendary reputation of the MG42 or the Browning M1919. But its significance runs deeper. It was Japan's first genuine step toward a modern system of infantry fire support, arriving at a moment when armies everywhere were wrestling with the same question. How do you give an ordinary squad the ability to generate its own automatic firepower? Before the First World War, the answer had been simple. Rifles for soldiers, heavy machine guns for specialized crews, with a wide gap between them. A squad could move fast but lacked firepower, while a heavy gun could devastate a target but was too slow and cumbersome for an advance. The light machine gun was meant to close that gap, and the Type 11 was Japan's answer. The most interesting part of its story isn't the mechanism, it's the idea behind it. The Army didn't just want a machine gun, it wanted a weapon that felt like a natural extension of a rifle squad, using ammunition and chargers soldiers already carried. From a logistics standpoint, this was extremely attractive. Every army struggles with supply, and each new type of cartridge adds another burden. But history taught an important lesson. A weapon of war can't be judged on logistics alone. It has to work in a soldier's hands, in the mud, the rain, the heat, the cold, under enemy fire. And that is exactly where the Type 11 ran into its limits. Military history often judges weapons too simply as either successes or failures, but reality is more complicated. Many important weapons were never perfect, they were necessary stepping stones. The Type 11 was exactly that kind of weapon. It showed Japanese engineers what worked and what didn't, proved that every unit needed a light machine gun, and shaped the requirements for every Japanese machine gun that followed. Without the Type 11, there would have been no Type 96, and without the Type 96, no Type 99. Each design correcting the mistakes of the one before it. That's what real progress in weapons design looks like. Not a perfect first attempt, but constant, incremental improvement. The Type 11 was built for an army that placed enormous weight on discipline, endurance, and aggressive infantry action. One that wanted to move fast, attack in small units, and carry its own fire support. It was a weapon for maneuver, not static warfare. But the nature of war itself was shifting. The Second World War underscored the value of heavier volumes of fire, larger ammunition reserves, and mass production. Precisely why later designs adopted higher capacity magazines. Armies worldwide reached the same conclusion. A slightly heavier weapon that always works beats an ultralight one that demands constant attention. Today, surviving examples of the Type 11 are rare historical artifacts, sitting in museums and private collections, prized by collectors for their unusual design. Produced in smaller numbers than the Arisaka rifle, and with many examples destroyed after the war, every surviving Type 11 is a genuine piece of Japan's military-industrial history. A window onto an era when engineers were searching for a balance between weight, reliability, firepower, and ease of production. The Type 11 light machine gun was never a perfect weapon. Its feed system was complicated, it demanded careful maintenance, and its flaws became obvious once real fighting began. But it would be a mistake to write it off as simply a failed experiment, because the history of weapons isn't measured by victories alone. It's measured by ideas, and the idea behind the Type 11 mattered. It appeared at a moment when armies worldwide were shifting from a soldier with a rifle to a squad with its own firepower, and it was Japan's first answer to that new reality. Designed by Kijiro Nambu, adopted in 1922, carried by Japanese soldiers in China and through the early years of the Second World War, and eventually replaced by the more capable Type 96 and Type 99. The Type 11 remained a weapon of transition. But weapons like that are often the most interesting of all, because they don't show you the finished result. They show you the process of searching for one. Every history of weapons includes designs that changed the course of wars, some of which became legends, and others that played a different role entirely, becoming a bridge between the old and the new. The Type 11 light machine gun was exactly that kind of weapon. It wasn't the most powerful, the simplest, or the most reliable, but it became Japan's first real step toward the modern concept of a squad-level light machine gun. Its creators were trying to solve the problem of their own time, building a weapon meant to fuse the capabilities of the rifle and the machine gun into one. And although the war exposed the limits of that idea, it also revealed its importance. Because every successful weapon begins with a question, and the Type 11 was one of Japan's first attempts to answer it. How should the soldier of the future fight? That's exactly why, despite all its flaws, this unusual machine gun earns its place in history, not as the most perfect weapon ever built, but as the weapon that helped shape the generation that followed it. The Type 11 light machine gun, Japan's first attempt to give every infantry squad its own automatic firepower.